Hey guys, welcome back to part two of the political geography historical events. So we left off with India's partition. Again, this was British India, and after World War II, 1950s, late 1940s into the 1950s, they decided to give this area, this region, its independence, and rather than creating one large country, they decided that it was probably better to create two separate countries. They created Pakistan and India. This led to one of the largest migrations in human history, with the people who were Muslims migrating into Pakistan and the people who were Hindus migrating back into India. Next, let's talk about the Korean War, the Korean conflict. Again, this was one of the main causes was this Cold War, the tension between the Soviet Union and the United States and its Western allies. So on June 25th, 1950, soldiers from the North Korean People's Army, so this is the Communist North Korea, crossed the 38th parallel. The 38th parallel was that border that divided North Korea from South Korea. And they crossed that 38th parallel and crossed into the South Korea. And basically, this 38th parallel, which today is also referred to as the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, this is the boundary between the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the north and the pro-Western Republic of Korea to the south. The American troops, they'd enter the war on the South Korea's behalf, and again, the Soviet Union had entered the war on the North Korean behalf, and this was seen as a war against the forces of international communism. Again, this was what's considered a proxy war between two larger groups. The fighting lasted a few years, but the fighting was then stalled and casualties mounted. In July 1953, the Korean conflict came to an end, and they did again establish that DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, between the 38th parallel and this Korean peninsula is still divided. Today we know that this is still a hot button, major area of potential conflict today. Next, we have the Berlin Wall. Following World War II, Germany was divided into East and West Germany. East Germany was backed by the Communists, the Soviet Union, and West Germany was backed by the democratic groups. So not only West Germany, but the Western European countries and Anglo-America of the United States and Canada. Berlin, the capital that is found in East Germany, it was divided into East and West. After the border between East and West Germany was secure by the Soviets and Communist East, many people immigrated to West Germany in Berlin. The Berlin Wall, was built by the Communist Russia to stop that immigration. This was a physical division between West Berlin and East Germany. This was a symbolic boundary between democracy and communism during the Cold War. This was a division from August 13, 1961 until the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989. Next, we have the Vietnam War. This was also a war arguably between communism and democracy. Again, another proxy war that lasted 10 long years. So we have the North Vietnamese, who were backed by the communists in Soviet Union, and the Viet Cong, which were the northern supporters in the South, versus South Vietnam Democratic with the help of the United States and its allies. So again, we had the North Vietnamese, who were led by the Viet Cong, who were supported by Communist Russia and Communist China at the time, and South Vietnamese, who were led by their democratic government and supported by the democracies in Western Europe and United States. This was a Cold War era conflict in Southeast Asia, which again was a shadow belt region between Communist Russia and the Democratic West. This was from November 1st, 1955 through the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975. combat, hand-to-hand combat, really lasted about 10 years. This was in Vietnam, but spilled over into Laos and Cambodia. And the reasons why this developed was because the United States and other anti-communist countries fought with the South Vietnamese to further the approach of containment. So this idea of keeping communism from spreading further than it already was, this domino effect that if one country fell to communism, every country in Southeast Asia would subsequently fall. So the result was the United States withdrew its troops in April of 1975, and the North Communists gained control of the South, reuniting the country under the communist government. Next, the space race. This was also against the United States and the Soviet Union, and this was the desire by both countries to have supremacy in the space exploration. This was between the mid-1900s, during the Cold War, throughout the Cold War into really the 1990s. And this took place obviously in outer space and the United States and the Soviet Union. And the reason was because both claimed it was essential for national security. Also, with the inventions during this time, the country would show its intellectual dominance. Keeping in mind that the space program is really not about the shuttle and putting astronauts and people into space. Much of it has to do with satellites, which historically were used for spying on other areas. And so our important events, Sputnik was the first man-made satellite, 1957. The first people in space were the cosmonauts, Yuri Gagarin and the astronaut Alan Shepard in 1961. The first person to orbit Earth was John Glenn in 1962. And the first men on the moon were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the Apollo 11 in 1969. Next, let's talk about the Gulf War. So we've had multiple wars in Iraq. So this was the first Gulf War, which was Iraq versus the United States, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and 30 other allies. At first, the international community placed economic sanctions on Iraq, who had invaded Kuwait, but ultimately it led to military involvement. When this was August 2nd, 1990 to February 28th, 1991, which was President George H.W. Bush, so the first President Bush. And this was in Southwest Asia, mainly in Iraq, who had invaded Kuwait. And historically, Iraq claimed Kuwait as part of Iraq, and they invaded Kuwait in August 1990. The Western powers, Western allies did come to the defense of Kuwait. This concludes our historical background information in political geography. Thanks for listening.